Thank you, Justice Foy. It's kind of a tricky task that I'm going to try and do now, which is to synthesise what we've just heard from the floor, together with the thinking that the Chair, together with the Expert Advisory Group and the Secretariat, have done over the last number of months to try to identify what are these issues. And I suppose unsurprising to see a lot of the things that we have identified as being important have come up on the floor this morning, but also there are other issues that you've identified, so it just goes to show the value of the process and what we've just done. I suppose maybe just to come back to what we've done this weekend. So the purpose of this weekend was to look at what the existing arrangements are and what the existing law is and what that means in practical terms for the medical community. We heard from Owen Carlin, who provided us with a comprehensive overview of the law, focusing in particular on Article 40.3, subsection 3, and the subsequent legislation. And then the presentations you received from the medical community and the crisis pregnancy programme allowed you to understand how that current regime operates in practice. And then finally today we heard from Mark Sheehan about ethics. So in putting together the structure for the weekend, as the Chair has kept referring to, we made a conscious decision that it would only be about information about the current legal framework, and we acknowledge we have to go beyond that. We gave a brief to our speakers, which I know came up in some of the Q&A. It was not to stray beyond that. There was a bit of frustration in the room about that, and that's something that we recognised would emerge, and we're going to have to just deal with that in future weekends. These are the arguments that you've identified in your roundtables that we are going to have to get into in detail. So we've asked you to consider it, and obviously you have. We have considered it. We have lots of our own thoughts on it. So I just want to briefly say a few words about how we think we might approach what we've heard from the floor versus what together, combined with what our thinking on it. So many tables mentioned fetal abnormalities or life-limiting conditions. And within this topic alone, you've identified a number of sub-issues. For example, you want to gain an understanding of the current care paths for a woman who wants to receive a diagnosis or receives a diagnosis that their baby has one of these conditions, and the care paths for those babies once that diagnosis has been received in the event that the woman decides to continue. So there are two sides of that issue. You also have come from the floor to say genetics is important in this context, and that's something I think we'll have to come back to. Based on the feedback this morning, it's also clear that the Assembly would like to hear more about what issues would arise for the state in the event that terminations were to be carried out in those circumstances. And again, another issue which has emerged here is the position with regard to international human rights law in that context. Each of these aspects clearly needs to be explored in detail, and we'll have to look at that. Another topic which has emerged in feedback today is in relation to abortion in the case of rape and incest. Again, in keeping with the approach taken for this weekend, it would be important to begin consideration of this topic by presenting you, we think, with the facts about the current situation, what happens currently for women who are raped and become pregnant and wish to carry out a termination in those circumstances. And then the Assembly might look at the issues which would arise if the state were to allow abortions in those circumstances. Then, building on what you've heard today from Mark Sheehan, the members have identified that you'd like to hear more about the ethical perspectives, representing the range of views and perspectives on the debate. And you've already identified some of those in the roundtable session that you had with Mark earlier, so that's clearly something which is coming through. And you've also identified that you want to hear more about what happens in other jurisdictions. And we've done a bit of thinking about this, and identified around the table was that, to provide an overview of what happens around the world would be helpful in itself, and then also to look at some specific case studies. We've been doing some thinking about that. We feel that such an approach would serve to illustrate how the different regimes might operate in practice, and might explore the medical, legal and ethical implications in an Irish context looking at those regimes. A key question we asked you today is what type of people and what types of groups would you like to hear on this issue? And I think very clearly we've heard that you want to hear from women, and this is something which comes as no surprise to anybody. And you want to hear from women across the spectrum. Women who have chosen to have an abortion or chosen not to have an abortion across a whole range of circumstances. The Chair and the Secretariat will need to consider carefully how we do that and how we achieve balance there, while at the same time we need to be very sensitive about the personal nature of those experiences, and so we'll have to think carefully about how that gets presented to yourselves. We have some thoughts on it, we have some ideas, and we'll be teasing that out and bringing them to you, as to how we might proceed on that one. We've also heard that you want to hear from advocacy groups who are campaigning in relation to the 8th Amendment and more broadly in terms of the issues. And as provided for in the Assembly's rules and procedures, the submission process will be hugely important in this context, because it allows us to identify the groups who would like to address the Assembly. The rules provide that the Assembly may choose to hear oral presentations from any representative group or individual to assist in its deliberations, and so that will be the mechanism by which we can identify groups. And I think all of the groups who you've mentioned this morning are likely to make submissions, if they haven't already, as part of that process. So, they need to engage in that process, and that's the best way for us to be able to assess them, to be able to make sure that there is that balance that so many of you have spoken about. I think we'll also have to give you some grounding in the role of the Constitution and the separation of powers as it's described, who makes the laws and who can change those laws once they're made. And we'd given some thought to that, and that keeps bubbling up in the room as well, and that'll be important as we look at how the recommendations will be ultimately framed and so on. Aligned to that, I suppose, is the uncertainty with the current law, and that came through in the questions and answer sessions, and there's some frustration in the room with that, and I think we'll have to look very closely at that and see how we're going to capture that in future sessions. And I suppose finally the work programme, before I just conclude, I suppose there was a couple of other things that came up. The regulatory guidelines, which we referred to throughout the weekend, I think we'll have to come back to that. This issue of conscientious objection, which came up around then the round tables. And quite a number of tables identified disadvantage and vulnerable social groups, and also more kind of broad social issues like adoption and fostering and so on, status of refugees and those types of issues. I think we need to give consideration to that, and also the fathers' rights and men's issues is something we'll have to give time to. But a number of tables it came up, whether or not we'd be checking back in with you, and I suppose the work programme as we see it and how we'll break it down over the remaining 3 weekends will have to include lots of space for deliberation, both in terms of how you look at the questions and answers and the roundtable discussions, but also more generally to consider the issues and how we might go forward. Given the complexity of this topic, we think it's very important to build in sufficient time into the programme to allow for that. We started the process this weekend, obviously, by this session, and will continue to be a feature of our work. It's hugely important that we continue to check back, because it is an exercise in deliberative democracy, and that's what this is all about. I think it's fair to say that the Chair, the Secretariat and our expert advisory group will now have to consider carefully all this feedback. I mean, it was incredibly rich in terms of what we've heard from you today and what you want to hear from. And we'll try to incorporate it into a draft plan for the coming weeks. And it's a hope that we'll be able to put that in broad terms on the website, so that'll be a basis by which we might look at how we're going to do the remaining weekends. But it's important to say that that work programme will be a work in progress. We'll have to continue to come back to you, to check in with you, to make sure that we have the balance right and that we're providing you with the information you need to make recommendations to the House of the Oireachtas in accordance with the resolution providing for the establishment of the Assembly. So that's it. I hope I've summarised what's come from the floor, and I'll now hand over to the Chair to conclude.